Okay, the committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time, and this hearing is titled Article 1, Restoring Capacity and Equipping Congress to Better Serve the American People. And I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. I'm excited to be here today, gaveling in our first hearing of the new year. This committee has had an incredibly productive last year, passing 45 recommendations focused on making Congress more effective and efficient so that it can better serve the American people. And I'm proud of what we've accomplished as a committee so far, and I'm equally proud of how we've accomplished our work together. Every member of this committee has been fully engaged in the committee's work, has taken real time to think about the issues in our mandate, to share their own perspectives, and to really listen and consider their colleagues' perspectives. This process has worked because members of this committee are invested in the committee's work and in finding collaborative solutions to the challenges that this institution faces. And the key word here is invested. Successful institutions, whether we're talking about businesses or organizations or governments, depend on people who are invested in the work that they're doing, and that's fundamental. But successful institutions also invest in themselves. They invest in their employees, their infrastructure, and in the overall work environment and experience. They think and plan with an eye toward the future. The bottom line is that it's hard for people to be fully invested in their work if their work isn't fully invested in them. Congress has managed to attract extremely talented and dedicated staff, and committees like this one continue to be productive despite the many challenges that the institution faces. Congress is fueled by people who believe strongly in the mission that they're elected or hired to do, but fulfilling that mission has become harder over the past several decades, primarily due to decisions and choices that Congress has made. Today's about looking inward. The framers created Congress as the first among co-equal branches of government. Article 1 establishes the legislative branch and enumerates Congress's constitutional powers. But Congress's capacity to uphold these powers has weakened. This was a theme across many of our hearings last year, and because it drastically affects Congress's ability to properly serve the American people, we felt it appropriate to kick off our recently granted second year by putting Article 1 front and center. Today's hearing will help us understand the factors that have contributed to the expansion of executive branch power since World War II and shed light on how and why Congress has reduced its own capacity to fulfill its constitutional obligations. Most importantly, we'll consider what can be done to restore Congress to its rightful place as a co-equal branch of government. The framers never intended for extraordinarily consequential decisions to be made by one person or one branch of government. That's the beauty of our system, and I look forward to hearing recommendations from our witnesses today for how to rebuild Congress's capacity and strengthen the legislative branch. Before turning it over to Vice Chair Graves, I wanted to quickly acknowledge that we have a group of students here from Virginia Tech who are learning about congressional capacity and oversight. I'm obviously biased, but I think these issues are incredibly important, and I think it's great that people want to learn about this stuff. So welcome, and thank you for taking an interest in our work. Yeah. And I even see them coming in. Welcome, students. Thank you for being here. With that, I'd like to invite our Vice Chair, Tom Graves, to share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to echo the Chair's excitement and gratitude for a very productive and sort of a historic and history-making year for this committee. 45 recommendations in total, all unanimously bipartisan, with a significant piece of legislation to match is a great testament to this committee and our work that we've been able to do. And I'm excited to see what we can accomplish in this year, in this new year that we've been granted, and grateful for your bipartisan leadership, Mr. Chairman, and the good times we've had together going on the speaking tour together. It's a great meeting we had earlier today with a great group that's interested in what we're doing here, and I know some of y'all represented that group. But we've learned a lot over the last year about the way the legislative branch functions, and I think we've heard a little bit more about the ways it doesn't function. And the founders created the legislative branch to act as a co-equal branch of government. Our powers are clearly laid out, and we are all familiar with our day-to-day duties as representatives of the American people. But these rules and regulations, as envisioned by the founders, are not as they exist today. The American people's first branch is no longer truly equal. We will hear more from our witnesses about this today, but between the growing power of the executive branch, diminishing staff capacity, and a refusal to invest in ourselves at times, we've got a lot of work to do. A diminished Article 1 branch means ultimately a diminished government for the people we serve, and that's not the goal of this committee. Our goal is to return that authority back to this body. This committee is exploring ways to reinvest and strengthen our Congress so that we can ultimately better serve the American people and all those that we represent. And I'm really excited about today's hearing and our witnesses who are joining us. And Mr. Chairman, happy to yield back.
Thank you. Today, we welcome the testimony of our four witnesses. Our first witness is Rachel Augustine Potter. Dr. Potter is an assistant professor of politics at the University of Virginia. Her research interests include American political institutions, regulation, public policy, public administration, and the influence of separation of powers on bureaucratic decision-making. Before becoming a political scientist, she worked for several governmental institutions, including the White House Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and the German Federal Ministry of the Interior. Our next witness is Kevin Kosar, Vice President of Research Partnerships at the R Street Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization. Dr. Kosar directs R Street's Governance Department, co-directs the nonpartisan Legislative Branch Capacity Working Group, which aims to strengthen Congress, and establish legbranch.org, an online hub for congressional reform and scholarship. Before joining R Street, Dr. Kosar worked for the Congressional Research Service for more than a decade, where he served as an analyst and research manager. He's co-editor of the forthcoming book, Congress Overwhelmed, Congressional Capacity and the Prospects for Reform. No pressure. Third, Elise Bean is the Washington co-director of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School. From 1985 to 2014, Ms. Bean worked for U.S. Senator Carl Levin, including 15 years at the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Appointed his PSI staff director and chief counsel in 2003, Ms. Bean handled investigations, hearings, and legislation on such matters as money laundering, corporate misconduct, corruption, and tax abuse. In 2014, after Senator Levin retired and the Levin Center at Wayne Law was established in his honor, Ms. Bean joined the center to work on strengthening legislative capabilities at the federal, state, local, and international levels to conduct investigations and oversight. And last but not least is John Hudak. Did I get that right? All right. John Hudak, Deputy Director of the Center for Effective Public Management and a Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at Brookings. Dr. Hudak's research examines questions of presidential power in the context of administration, personnel, and public policy. His book, Presidential Pork: White House Influence Over the Distribution of Federal Grants, demonstrates that pork barrel politics occur beyond the halls of Congress. His other work explores how agency staffing, expertise, and institutional structure facilitates or hinder presidential power and influence. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written remarks will be made part of the record. Dr. Potter, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. While today's hearing focuses on congressional capacity, my testimony focuses on changes in the capacity of the executive branch over time. The executive branch began modestly. George Washington had a small personal staff of just a few individuals, and the cabinet consisted of just 3 departments. Obviously, that's a very different executive branch than the one we know today, which is sophisticated, complex, and large. Much of the transformation in the executive branch occurred in the period after World War II, and that's where my comments will focus. I will make 3 points about the growth of the executive branch. First, the federal bureaucracy has dramatically expanded its policymaking and implementation capabilities. Second, and concurrently, the powers of the Office of the Presidency have expanded. And third, numerous factors gave rise to these trends. Allow me to elaborate on each point. First, with respect to the bureaucracy, there's been an inexorable increase in its size and scope. Between 1946 and 1997, an average of 8 new agencies was created each year. Today, there are estimated to be 278 agencies in the executive branch. The growth in the capacity of the executive branch is reflected in its output. Each year, federal agencies issue an average of 2,500 proposed rules and 3,500 final rules. Many of these rulemakings expand and entrench the power of the executive branch. One notable trend about the growth in the bureaucracy is that while it has amassed more and more responsibility over time, there have not been commensurate increases in staffing. Civilian employment has hovered at approximately 2 million individuals since 1950. This may seem confusing. How is it that the executive branch is accomplishing so much more without commensurate increases in staffing. A key factor is that contractors increasingly perform the work of government. One estimate puts the current ratio of federal employees to contractors at 1 to 3. This means that in practice, the executive branch workforce has grown, but in a less visible and less accountable way. Second, at the same time the federal bureaucracy has grown, the Office of the President has seen a significant expansion in its ability to make policy in at least 3 ways. First, presidents have increasingly relied on unilateral action to accomplish policy goals. While executive orders receive the lion's share of public attention, there are actually many ways a president can act unilaterally. And across this broad class of actions, the overall trend has been one of consistent overtime growth. Second, the president has amassed increased powers with respect to war and emergency. Despite congressional attempts to limit unilateral authority with respect to war, the president retains tremendous autonomy when it comes to deploying troops abroad and conducting military operations. Additionally, the president has an increased number of emergency authorities and broad latitude in deploying them. Third, the president's policymaking, advisory, and supervisory capabilities have also grown substantially. For instance, the Executive Office of the President, which was created in 1939, now employs about 2,000 people. This organ provides the president with a sophisticated ability to develop new policy and manage the executive branch. My final point is that these trends have persisted under both Democratic and Republican administrations, and they can be attributed to numerous factors. First, domestic and international crises have expanded the reach of the executive branch. When the country is at crisis, there is demand for a coordinated national response, and the executive is well positioned to fulfill that role. Second, policy complexity contributes to the aggrandizement of the executive branch. The executive branch is capable of dealing with cross-cutting issues and giving sustained, in-depth attention to hard problems. This means that when new issues and problems emerge, the executive branch has often been the one to respond to them. Third, political polarization also magnifies the power of the executive branch. Partisan polarization can impede the productivity and routine functioning of Congress. When Congress does not act, problems do not go away. This means the president or the bureaucracy often steps up to the plate. Going forward, delegation to the executive branch will remain a necessary part of governance. The challenge confronting this important committee, then, is how to conduct oversight of the executive branch without stymieing its ability to function effectively. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Dr. Kosar, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Co-Chairman Graves, members of the Select Committee for holding this hearing and inviting me. We've just heard from Professor Potter about the growing scope of the executive branch, and to be sure, there's just no doubt about it. Government is widening the expanse of its efforts, and policy is becoming ever more complicated. In my written testimony, one thing I cite is that the original Landmark Education Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, was a mere 32 pages long. 40 years later, when we updated that in 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act was in the hundreds of pages. That's just one sign of government growing. Now, unfortunately, the preponderance of the evidence indicates that congressional capacity has not kept up with the expanse of government. So increasingly, you have an executive branch that is just not much directed by the legislative branch, and that certainly runs contrary to the plan laid out in our Constitution, and it creates real accountability troubles. As I noted in my written testimony, there are all sorts of factors of congressional capacity, and we don't have time to cover them all, and I was asked to focus on just one, which is people, the people whose efforts produce governance. And in particular, to focus on legislative staff and the legislative staff branch support agencies. The trends since the 1980s are very troubling. The number of total congressional staff have declined. The number of committee staff have declined. The percentage of personal staff working in DC has gone down, more are stationed out in the districts. The percentage of personal staff doing communications work as opposed to policy or oversight work has grown. And the number of staff working for the legislative branch support agencies, CRS, GAO, et cetera, also has gone down. So governance gets bigger and bigger, but the number of people who can help out with it within the legislative branch has actually contracted. And two troubling trends also merit mentioning with regard to staff. First of which, congressional staff salaries have been stagnant for many years, and we all know the price of living in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area has skyrocketed. And the result of this stagnation has been predictable. There is significant turnover amongst congressional staff, the folks who are here every day of the week trying to help you all govern. Committees in the House and the Senate saw an annual turnover rate of 21% in 2017. That's a big number. And when we surveyed staff 2 summers ago about their plans for the future, more than 2/3 said that they were looking to get out of Congress within 5 years. Now, where are these staff going? Not surprisingly, to more lucrative positions, one of which is lobbying. And this is the second troubling trend. The percentage of former congressional aides who have joined the influence industry has risen, and K Street regularly drains expertise from the legislative branch. And that's, behind all this is the basic fact which the professor alluded to, which is growing government. The congressional need for information to try to understand policy and the various issues you get jammed with every single day goes up and up because government's operations get bigger and bigger. But legislative capacity has lagged behind it, so what do you guys do? Well, you just triage the situation as best you can. Sometimes you get not-for-profit folks and professors and others who will come up and help out. Frequently, you have to depend on lobbyists, and lobbyists no doubt have their interests. So to conclude, let me be clear. I am a small government guy. I think our government is too big and is trying to do far too much. I would like to see it spend less and zero out ineffective agencies and program. I'm alarmed by our deficits, all that. Nonetheless, I think it is penny-wise and pound-foolish for Congress to skimp on staff, particularly committee and legislative branch agency support staff. Congress is supposed to be the first branch of government, the source for all legislative authority and governmental action. Congress is also the branch of government most accountable to the public for the policy choices our nation makes, which means Congress needs to grow its capacity to direct government and also to solve public problems. With that, I'll end my remarks, and I thank you for hearing my testimony and would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Kosar. Ms. Bean, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Oops. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Kilmer and Vice Chair Graves and all the members of the subcommittee for having this hearing on how to restore Congress as a true partner for the executive branch and the judiciary. I'm here on behalf of the Levin Center, and I have to mention we're part of the Wayne State University, but my views are on behalf of the center itself and not necessarily on behalf of the law school or the university. So we've just heard from the first 2 witnesses about how the executive branch has expanded in numbers, in funding, in activities. At the same time, Congress has lost staff, lost funding, and it is struggling to keep up. The particular thing I was asked to look at is oversight, because that's what Senator Levin championed, bipartisan, fact-based oversight. It's a key power of Congress because if you want good government, you've simply got to have good oversight. And yet, when we look at the quality of oversight over time, it has really varied from committee to committee and across issues. And part of the reason that we've just heard is a staffing problem. We have staff that is underpaid, that is few in number, that doesn't have the expertise that you need. So that's a real problem. But there's a bigger problem, and that's the whole issue of bipartisanship. I was an investigator for 30 years with Senator Levin. I found that if you investigated with somebody whose views matched your own, it was sort of operating like in an echo chamber. It was only when you investigated with somebody that had a fundamentally different worldview that you started to ask questions, you looked at different facts, you interpreted them differently, and you challenged each other about what happened and why. And it's really that important fact-based bipartisan operation that has really fallen off, and the testimony that I've given you goes into some of the factors. One of the things that I wanted to mention are 4 bipartisan recommendations that were made not only by the Levin Center, but by the Lugar Center, Project on Government Oversight, and American Oversight. They had 4 suggestions on a bipartisan basis that we thought you'd like to hear. First of all, legal opinions on issues having to do with oversight. For decades, the Department of Justice, the Office of Legal Counsel, has been issuing opinions directing the federal agencies on how they should respond to requests for information from Congress. And it's no surprise that those statements have favored the executive branch. Congress has no comparable process or set of legal opinions from its perspective on how federal agencies ought to respond. If we had that kind of process and we developed bipartisan, thoughtful, well-supported legal opinions, we would not only help committees, help members, set norms for inside and outside of Congress, and when Congress is forced to go to court, it would help us in the courts as well. Right now, the executive branch has that, we don't. So that's one of our recommendations. A second one is more mundane, but it has to do with bipartisan compensation of committee clerks. Clerks do a lot of work. They can create a safe space for bipartisan operations, as I'm sure you all know. And on the Senate side, the minority and majority parties get together, hire their administrative staff, and pay their salaries on generally a 50-50 basis. But in the House, in too many cases, we have a Democratic clerk and a Republican clerk. Not only does that waste money, but each of those clerks are being hired to answer to a particular party instead of both parties. So one thing that you could do that would actually save money and promote bipartisanship is to follow the Senate's lead and have your administrative personnel hired and paid by both parties on a 50-50 basis. Third suggestion has to do with hearings, and that has to do with question periods. Right now, we're operating under a 5-minute rule. But when you saw the impeachment proceedings, one of the things they did is they gave 45 minutes to each side at the beginning of the hearing. You had a more coherent hearing. You were able to have committee leadership go into detail, make the points that they wanted. There was time for committee counsel to participate. I would urge you, as we did on the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, we, on a regular basis, had much longer than 15 minutes on a bipartisan basis. Each side would get the same amount of time. But to get away from this 5-minute rule where members are struggling to get through their questions, the witnesses are playing games, it just doesn't lead to a good hearing. And oversight hearings are a lens through which the public views Congress. When a hearing is partisan, chaotic, hard to follow, that loses public confidence in Congress. When they're coherent, the members are prepared, they can speak in an easy way, your public confidence goes up. The last one I want to mention is a big one. It is having committee funding better reflect the composition of the House. On the Senate side, the composition of the funding for committees reflects, if we have 51-49, that's how the funding is split. In the House right now, we have a 51% majority that has 67% of the committee funding. While that might look pretty good to the majority party, for the foreseeable future, we have very narrow majorities. We have a divided country, and what looks good now could look pretty bad if the majority shifts, as it has done many times in the Senate. So that's our sort of other big bipartisan suggestion. We also have a couple of others just from the Levin Center about how you actually do investigations on a bipartisan basis, and I'm happy to talk about those as well. But I think the big point here is that all of you have made a commitment to try to restore the authority of Congress as an equal partner, and we certainly need your help to do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bean. Dr. Hudak, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair Graves, and members of the committee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. Before I begin, I need to note that the testimony today represents my own views and doesn't reflect an official position of the Brookings Institution or any of its component parts. As my fellow panelists have effectively highlighted, Congress has spent decades delegating power to the executive branch and right now stands at a moment in history where the institution is weakened. Congress's ability to perform its constitutionally mandated tasks has been hampered. And nowhere is this issue more important and more damning than in the arena of spending power. In Article 1, Sections 8 and 9 of the Constitution, Congress is charged to pass laws to fund government operations and make significant choices over the amount of money that's spent by which institutions and under what conditions. I would argue that in the past 20 years in particular, Congress has undermined its own spending power and simultaneously empowered the executive beyond practical necessity. Congressional choices have led to an untenable scenario that requires significant reform. Specifically, this has happened in 3 ways: the breakdown in the appropriations process, the weakening of congressional oversight, and the decision to ban congressional earmarks. In my written testimony, I discuss each of these, but in my limited time now, I'll focus on the last decision, the one to ban congressional earmarks. I believe one of the most significant mistakes Congress made in ceding spending authority to the executive involved banning earmarks in the early days of the 112th Congress. During the 2000s and culminating in the 2010 midterm elections, earmarks were painted as a coven for corruption, a practice reserved for the funding of needless projects to benefit the friends, supporters, and donors of members of Congress. Much of this was hyperbole, as earmarking was abused only by a handful of members in the past. But in response to those abuses, Congress initially chose to institute tighter rules around the practice. Those rules included restrictions on what members could request and for whom. The rules also enacted unprecedented levels of transparency in an effort to dissuade members from engaging in the types of bad acts that made headlines at the time. That transparency allowed public oversight to complement congressional oversight. Those rules, imperfect but a step in the right direction, were deemed insufficient to sustain the practice, and politics, rather than prudence, ultimately won the day. However, legislators on both sides of the aisle, legislators who rarely agreed on anything, including Harry Reid and Jim Inhofe, opposed the ban, recognizing this was a separation of powers issue that would weaken the legislative branch and strengthen the executive. They were right. Legislators understand the needs of their districts and their states oftentimes better than bureaucrats and appointees, and the ability of legislators to deliver on those needs is not an obscene abuse of power. It is a constitutional obligation and a constituent expectation. The earmark ban was not only bad policy, but the justifications for it were off the mark. One reason for the earmark ban was the false claim that earmarking led to exploding deficits. It did not. Earmarking did not grow the size of the federal spending pie. It simply influenced the size of the slices. An earmarking system can be implemented with strict adherence to a chairman's mark and with other rules that ensure overall spending does not increase, but the individual spending decisions change. The Bipartisan Policy Center, for instance, has proposed effective safeguards to protect the integrity of earmarking should Congress return to this practice. Another part of the justification for the earmark ban was that politics, rather than need, entered into the practice in corruptive ways. Surely politics affects legislative earmarking as it affects any spending decision. However, the political nature of earmarks is not synonymous with corruption. The earmark ban did not rid federal spending of politics. It simply transferred political considerations from one branch to another. The chairman, in his introduction, was kind enough to plug my 2014 book called Presidential Pork, and I'll plug it again. In that book, I examine all project-based federal spending decisions from 1996 to 2001, over $1 trillion worth of spending. The analysis shows that presidents are election-driven individuals, and the executive branch gives disproportionate sums of grant dollars to reflect a president's political needs. Politics affects the distribution of a non-trivial portion of the federal budget, and Congress has made choices over which branch will engage in earmarking. Right now, as in the past, presidential earmarks are happening while Congress officially refuses to engage in the practice. The politicization of federal funding is real, and when Congress cedes authority over spending decisions to the executive branch, it also ensures that presidential politics disproportionately influences federal spending decisions. Taking back power from the executive branch is often a challenge that requires overriding a presidential veto, which in a polarized Congress is increasingly difficult. However, a return to normal appropriations, an increase in legislative oversight, particularly via spending authority, and earmark reform that both returns the practice while strengthening its integrity requires no presidential sign-off. In fact, each step rests solely within the purview of Congress, and it would allow legislators to increase capacity, better represent their constituents, uphold their oath, and recommit to the spirit and the letter of Article 1 of the Constitution. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We're going to head into questions, and I'm going to yield my time to Representative Scanlon. I know you've got another hearing to get to.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you, Chairman Kilmer and Vice Chair Graves, for holding this hearing. You know, we've had a number of hearings talking about kind of the practical impact of issues, so it's really interesting to get to the constitutional underpinnings of what we're trying to do here. Certainly, I'm new to the body, but have heard quite a bit about ceding power to the executive and that we probably need to take some measures to claw it back. I have been astonished at the brilliance of our staff. both on the committee and the folks who are willing to work for members. But because of funding, et cetera, they don't stay very long. And as brilliant as they may be, if they can't afford to have a mortgage or they can't afford to start a family, they end up lacking some life experiences that might be helpful. And we end up with, the brain drain or the lack of institutional memory. So very interested in, I guess maybe I'll just turn to Dr. Kozar, if you could speak a little bit more to the effect about the disparity between permanent staffing in the executive and what's become kind of a revolving door in the legislature, the effect that this has on our ability to function as a co-equal branch.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from the perspective of a staffer, the incentives are extremely strong to either go to the private sector or go to the executive branch. In each case, the pay's better. You look at the general schedule and the pay there, and it regularly gets increased. Locality adjustments, all that sort of stuff, it goes up and up. Congress, meanwhile, has kept a cap on not only paying members, but that trickles down and also affects staff. And so a staffer can make what amounts to a kind of lateral move and over to the executive branch and very quickly see $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 difference in pay. Plus, they also get to be tethered to a schedule that is a little more controllable, which as you decide to do the family thing, or if you just get tired of doing the chaotic hill sort of exercise, can be extremely appealing. Now, when it comes to the private sector, Professor Tim Lapiro of Madison University has put together some data on that, and it gets into the kind of low-level multiples that you can get from opting off to go to K Street. I mean, I can tell you I myself, a couple of years ago, I had a staffer who was looking to get off the Hill, had less than 10 years of service, but had served on some important committees, and come in and asked me about possibly getting a job at the think tank, and rapidly noted that, he figured his fair market value was at least $225,000. Obviously, we didn't employ that, but he did find a job quite promptly and is doing quite well.
Okay. So obviously raising pay is one thing, and I note when I was looking over some of the charts that you noted that the member allowances and member pay hasn't increased, and then of course you note that in the charts that the number of office staff has reduced because that's the only way that you can raise anyone's pay to kind of keep it in line is to hire less staff, which obviously also would have an impact on the member.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sort of effect is also happening at the legislative branch support agencies. My agency, I used to work for Congressional Research Service, at one point employed 900 persons. They're down to a little over 600 now. And if you keep the spending the same and the salaries are going to increase up a little bit, well, by definition, you're going to end up with fewer people. There's just less FTEs to do the work there.
In addition to pay raises, do you have other staffing-related recommendations that you would like to highlight?
Sure. We did a survey of congressional staff in summer 2017. We got a good wide range of respondents from both chambers and people in a variety of positions. And certainly the compensation was an issue. Student loan repayment was flagged as a concern just because you can only carry so much debt so far, and if you don't have a lot to cover your housing, the amount of repayments you make it's kind of a trap. There was also a concern about the lack of an obvious career ladder. I mean, you come in and it's not as if there's a clear path forward. To some degree, it feels like there's this brutal competition to elbow somebody else aside so you can take their spot. Otherwise, you're going to be staying in the same spot, or you just have to bail from your member's office no matter how much you like them and go somewhere else because that's it. And that's nerve-wracking, and that's not to everybody's taste. So career development, being able to show folks that yes, you can build a career here. There's the way you can move up. There are the various opportunities for moving up, and coupled with that is the training. Again, the feeling of being pitched into a seat, told to go, catch a couple CRS seminars on ledge process or something like that in your spare time, but there's pressing legislative business, so don't be going too long. everyone arrives here in DC as an amateur. None of us come professionally trained to do this work. And if we could just pause and give staff a little more time to be able to invest in their skills so that they can deal with the deluge coming at them, I think that would be quite valuable.
Just one more question. Dr. Hudak, your testimony, in addition to the member-directed spending issues, addresses omnibus bills and the breakdown of the appropriations process and the impact that has on our ability to do oversight. Can you comment on the impact of staff reduction and lack of retention on those issues?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. The staff reduction really hits the Appropriations Committee in an outsized way. If there is significant staff turnover on a committee that requires ongoing yearly negotiations, those relationships are so critically important to the success of subcommittees and then ultimately the committee, and then the work across the chambers as well. Being able to trust an individual who you've worked on appropes with before is critically important to making sure that you can have a working relationship in the future. And every, as my fellow panelists said, every committee faces these same sort of challenges, but because of the constitutional requirements of appropriations, this is so important to think at least a little differently about in terms of training, in terms of salary, in terms of even the relationship and the environment that a subcommittee chair or the chairman of the committee creates within, in order to see it more as a family, more as an ongoing working relationship that is not driven by partisanship, that's not driven by whoever the chairman has to be, but is driven by the constitutional commitment that the members of the committee and the staff on that committee is bound to. And so, as I said, I think we should think about capacity across all committees, but nowhere is that more important than approps.
I have seen some extremely vigorous head nodding from both the audience and members, so thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Vice Chair Graves is also yielded, so I'm going to call on Mr. Newhouse for 5 minutes.
Does that mean I get to go somewhere else too, Derek? I'll follow you. Well, thank you all for being here. This is a tremendously interesting topic, and that I can't help but think that all the discussion about congressional capacity and the growth of the executive branch and its power and privileges, Congress has been helpful in that, very complicit in. So I guess we can't blame the presidential or the executive branch. We've allowed it to happen, we being the congressional or legislative branch. So now what do we do about that? So I guess there's a lot of things that we can talk about there, but Dr. Hudak, and we did notice your shameless plugging of your book, but that's okay. Presidential pork, something we've been talking about for a long time here is congressionally directed spending, and that truly is a constitutional responsibility of the legislative branch, not the executive branch. So in your observations, you talked a little bit about it, but I want you to, if you could, expand on some of the things that, if this is put back into place, and that debate is ongoing, but if we do go back to some kind of congressional directed spending, tell us some of the things that, as far as transparency or structure, help us avoid some of the pitfalls that led to its demise to begin with, and how we could structure it so it would be successful.
To return to earmarking, there's going to be a policy aspect of what needs to change in Congress, but also a political conversation that needs to happen. And I think a return to earmarking requires a bipartisan commitment, bipartisan cooperation, in order for one party not to be able to accuse another party, or one chamber even to accuse another chamber of trying to corrupt the process or bring corruption back to the process. Earmarks are not about corruption. Earmarks are about serving your constituents, and that messaging needs to come from the leadership of both parties and the leadership of both chambers first. Second, I think the types of reforms that were initially put into place in the late 2000s were a good first step in terms of publicizing a member's name who is requesting an earmark, the recipient of that, the purpose of the earmark, and swearing that the member and the member's spouse do not have a financial connection to the recipient or the company or the organization that's receiving it. That's a great first step. I think greater transparency is necessary. Perhaps having an independent entity within Congress, having it run through the Ethics Committee, or have a select committee formed that vets each of these earmarks or vets them in groups, is going to be very important, I think, to ensure both to ensure the integrity of the system, but also to ensure that there's public confidence in the system. You know, most constituents love earmarks. They just don't like the other congressman's earmarks. Understanding that Congress is looking out as the guardian of this process, and that there is enough transparency so that researchers like me, media organizations, and those institutions within the Congress can make sure that this is being done right, will be a very helpful part of moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Well, I agree with your statement that certainly as we as elected representatives of the people know our districts better than a bureaucrat in the executive branch. So, Mr. Kozar, you, in your testimony, compared the different staffing levels from a couple decades ago till now. I think the only offices that I know of that have increased staffing levels are in leadership. And so certainly, while we have ceded power to the executive branch because we're cutting back on staff, would you say that perhaps there has been some ceding from the rank and file to House leadership because of staff disparities?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the model of Congress in the last 50 years has transformed fundamentally. This used to be a place where there were incredibly powerful chairs who were often interlocked with these kind of iron triangles with the bureaucracy and an interest group, and they commanded resources, they drove policy, they had large staffs. They were power brokers. Lyndon Johnson, speaking of the chairman, referred to them as the whales on the hill, and everybody else were the minnows. And that's gone away. The powers of chairs declined, the resources available have declined, and yeah, the data show. I mean, the number of staff that leadership have in both chambers has increased dramatically. It's a different model of running the place. It's much more hierarchical, top-down.
Something that many of us lament the fact that has happened. But thank you all for being here. I appreciate the discussion. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Lofgren.
Thanks so much, and I'm sorry I missed most of the oral testimony, but I've had a chance to read the written testimony, and I think there's a lot of good ideas in there. Let me just ask a couple of questions. Ms. Bean, you suggested that the House have kind of rival Office of Legal Counsel reports, which is interesting. Some of us have thought that we ought to require the publication of the Office of Legal Counsel opinions. In a way, it's kind of secret law. Nobody has approved it. No one, in some cases, even knows the positions being taken. I would think not only should we require that, but also if the House does counter positions, we should equally publicize that. What do you think that would do?
I agree with you. There are a lot of OLC opinions that nobody knows about that is controlling federal agency policy. And the ones that are made public, for example, a recent opinion that says a White House counsel has an absolute immunity to any request for testimony from Congress, that's actually completely opposite to the courts that have considered that opinion. And yet that is the policy of the executive branch. So I think publicizing it is important, but even more than that, the Congress needs to have its own answer in a bipartisan, thoughtful, well-supported legal opinions that when we go to court, we can say, we've had this opinion for 20 years that those people are subject to congressional subpoena and they should testify.
Let me ask you this, and several people, and most recently Mr. Newhouse, mentioned that it's been over a period of decades that power has shifted from the legislative branch to the executive branch, and I think that's clearly the case. How we rebalance that is a challenge, not only in terms of the institutional capacity, which you've addressed, but also in a fight between the ledge branch and the executive branch. And I've got a couple of ideas that I'd like each of you to comment on if you've got an idea about it. First, when the House or Senate believes the executive branch is violating a statute, ordinarily, we don't have standing to bring a case. And so if that is a legitimate belief, I mean, you could be wrong, I suppose, but if you feel the statute is being violated, you really look to others to bring the litigation, number one. Number two, when there's a challenge of that nature, the courts take their own sweet time. We have the capacity to require accelerated consideration in such matters. And the final question along those lines are the use of emergency powers. I've asked that we take Congressional Research Service to compile all of the emergency exceptions because they're babies, circumstances where the Congress thinks the emergency exception is being misused. Obviously, it's the third branch that's going to arbitrate that, but that only works if the Congress has standing, there's an accelerated review, and there's some standards for the courts to look at. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll just offer the thought that I think you're completely right, that Congress, this is part of the process of taking back some of the authority that we've given away to create a system where we, legislatively say, yes, we have standing, and yes, we can have an expedited process. Now, in some of those cases, that might require the president to sign on or to override a veto, so it's not an easy kind of thing, but that's exactly what Congress needs to do. If they want to rely on the judiciary to resolve some of these disputes, there has to be a more equal playing field when you go, because when they delay in the courts, a lot of times that delay actually is a substantive decision because something doesn't happen. You don't get the testimony, you have to make a decision without that information.
If, for example, the law is being misread by the executive, and 2 or 3 years goes on before it's resolved, there really may be nothing left to argue about.
Yes.
A final thought. In order for us to successfully counter the executive branch and fulfill our proper role, we need to function. You've addressed that in terms of staffing, but we have a real problem, not only in terms of partisanship, but frankly, in terms of the Senate and their rules. When any member can stop anything from happening, it is very tough for the Senate to legislate. Have you given some thought on what we could ask the Senate to do to become more functional?
I'm a strong supporter of the filibuster rule. I think it
It
stops
has
a lot
its-
of
it has its role.
bad things from happening. When the Senate wants to work quickly, it usually has to be on a bipartisan basis. So, I wouldn't agree with weakening the rule even further. When you look at the judicial nominations we're getting now, when you could filibuster, then both sides had to have nominees that were okay with both sides. Now that you can have a simple majority, we're getting judicial nominees that one party thinks is good and the other party doesn't think is good but can't do anything about it. So from my point of view, to push for bipartisanship, I would have a stronger, not a weaker filibuster rule.
My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to take Ms. Bean's advice about using my 5 minutes and ask 3 questions that I hope you'll submit back to me in writing and to the committee. The first, as it relates to the House and an equitable funding of staff on committees. No one believes Nancy Pelosi is the leader of the House. She's the leader of the Democratic Party. You don't believe John Boehner was the leader of the House. He's the leader of the Republican Party. We're a different institution than the Senate. Is a more equitable distribution the appropriate measure in an institution that's designed to be majority run, not run on the slimmest of margins? Can we adopt the Senate model, or are we a different institution and that model would not achieve our constitutional role? My second question is about the appropriate staffing level. We've looked at lots of charts about staff going up, staff going down. My staff, I was an LC on Capitol Hill in 1994. My LC today responds to more people in a shorter amount of time with a greater degree of complexity than we ever dreamed of doing. So what's a different level of capacity measurement, what's a different standard I can use than number of people? Because I don't think that really speaks to what we're trying to do in Article 1. It's just the most convenient one that I can find. And third, we've talked about bipartisan staff versus nonpartisan staff. I thought Ms. Bean's point was well taken. When you're doing an investigation, having people who don't have any ideology may not be the right answer. Having folks from opposing ideology working side by side may be the right answer. What I've found so valuable about this committee is not that people don't believe anything, but that people believe deeply things, but they're able to have that conversation together. Do we disadvantage ourselves by hiring more nonpartisan people at CRS, for example, as opposed to hiring a conservative budget analyst and a liberal budget analyst and having them produce that report together? My conversational question, I appreciate Mr. Hudak standing up for Article 1, 8, and 9. It's not that Congress should return to the practice of earmarking. It's not a practice, it's a constitutional responsibility. And the fact that we're so politically sensitive these days, we need to fight. I wanted to ask you all about something in Dr. Potter's testimony. Issues are complex. The executive branch does have more capacity. We are passing legislation asking the executive branch to implement it. I'd be perfectly happy bringing that capacity back to the House, passing longer bills, to Dr. Kozar's point, that contain more details, but not leaving that to an unelected expert downtown to solve. In today's 2020 information flow, historically, I would have been worried that Congress can't respond fast enough. Today, with litigation, the executive branch often responds more slowly than Congress can. Is now the appropriate time in restoring Article 1 to bring back all of those regulatory responsibilities from the executive branch and begin to have the Energy and Commerce Committee write carbon control policy rather than EPA write that same policy? And Dr. Potter, you raised that in your point number 2. I'll start with you.
So I think there's much to be said for all of these points. The point I want to make in response to your comment about complexity is that complexity is increasing. I think that came across in all 4 of our written testimonies. And one thing in making these reforms that you don't want to do is sort of check the executive branch so much that it can't do its own job, right? So what you're suggesting is that Congress should take back some of that role. I think a lot of the reforms my co-panelists have suggested would help in that regard. But some of these issues are so very, very complex that I would think it might be useful to have someone who spends their whole career studying air pollution, working on air pollution policy at the EPA. I think there's some benefit to having career bureaucrats do a lot of this work.
It is obvious to you that air pollution expert should reside in an executive branch agency rather than on the Energy and Commerce Committee.
I think a lot of that depends on whether we can get people to, as Dr. Kozar said, view this as a career, right? So a lot of my students who come to me, they want a career in government and they ask about careers in the executive branch because there is a career path. And right now, that same career path options for these experts don't lie as much in the legislative branch. So the capacity right now is not there. If it could be built over time, I think that there is role, and I think Dr. Kozar has written some proposals for, since we're talking about air pollution, for a congressional regulatory office, and I think that would be a really good idea for Congress to consider.
I have made Ms. Bean's point, Mr. Chairman. I got one answer from one witness, and now my 5 minutes has expired. I blame myself on time management.
But like 11 questions in, which was great. Next up, Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here and participating. This is a really important discussion. Ms. Potter, I wanted to start with you. You talked about how the executive branch has grown, but a lot of that has been not in staff, but in contractors. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you think the impact of that is. Do they have the same incentives? Is there an incentive to keep having more work to do for the sake of making money? What impact do you think that has?
So I think we don't know a lot about contractors in the executive branch. It's something as a researcher that it's very frustrating to know exactly how many they are and what they're doing because there's not a lot of transparency. So Contractors they're an excellent temporary workforce. If we're having like a peak in workload, it's great to turn to the private sector. But a lot of the issues, again, that we're facing are long-term complex problems, and we're relying on contractors to do that work. In terms of what kinds of problems that creates, they're not subject to the same legal legal requirements that bureaucrats are, right? So the Freedom of Information Act and judicial review don't apply the same to contractors that they do. So I think in terms of like long-term government management, contractors are not the way we want to run our government, but it is currently how we are running a lot of our government, even though we don't see it. And there's a lot of reasons that we ended up here, but I don't think this is what we want to be doing with our workforce in the long term.
And from an oversight standpoint, if we don't have the transparency to answer some of the questions that you were talking about, that clearly is a problem too.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Hudak, you talked in your written testimony, you spoke about earmarks already in our discussion, but in your written testimony, you talk about the link between oversight and appropriations. Can you elaborate on that and talk a little bit about why you think that those are if we don't do a good job on the appropriations process, the challenge that creates for us in oversight?
Absolutely. This Congress, the House, I should say, in the past year did an admirable job in terms of the appropriations process relative to years past, at least in the recent past. That is important for the function of the Congress. It's important for the function of the Appropriations Committee, but it's a critical check on the executive branch. By going through and doing the work of appropriations, you are looking line by line, program by program, agency by agency to understand what is going on within the executive branch. There are a lot of issues in Congress, in public policy broadly, that are true 50 years ago and they are true today. But there are other issues that either change over that time in dramatic ways or are no longer an issue that necessarily requires federal government attention. If you are not on an annual basis looking at these programs, you are not doing your job as overseers of the executive branch. You're not finding problems. You're not finding successes as well, places that perhaps need more funding to do better work or to continue that mission. But beyond the sort of direct way in which this is happening, there's an indirect way. If Congress is falling down on the job in terms of appropriations, you are telegraphing to the executive branch, whether that's Donald Trump's executive branch or Barack Obama's or George Bush's or whoever's, that we're not doing the hard work, and it's going to be harder for us to identify problems or to identify bad actions. Every administration has bad actors somewhere, whether they're appointees, whether they're civil servants. It's the nature of a large organization. And if the people who are supposed to do the accounting and the accountability are refusing to do that, you are, like I said, telegraphing to certain actors, you're probably not going to get caught. That's not what Congress is charged to do in the Constitution, and it's certainly not what your constituents charge you with when they send you here, but it's increasingly what's happening within the Congress.
And I guess if we don't get it done beforehand so that it's done and there's clear visibility for a full fiscal year, it makes it harder on oversight because there's the complexity that agencies are going through trying to operate in a short-term world, waiting for a longer-term bill to pass.
Absolutely. And in that context, it's much easier for mistakes to be made, too, when you're operating in those short-term funding waves. And as much as Congress is there to catch malfeasance, they're also there to catch when these mistakes happen and to help agencies make those corrections as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Let me recognize Mr. Timmons, and I'll put Mr. Pocan in the on-deck circle. You'll be next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing, and thank you all for coming and taking the time to testify today. My priorities this year are really divided into two categories. One is calendar, schedule, floor votes, and the second is budget. That's my priorities for this committee. I think the chairman has, we've talked about this at length, and I'm optimistic that we can find a path forward. I want to focus with y'all, I want to ask y'all about the calendar, the schedule, and floor votes. The calendar, this year, we will be here 55 full days. Last year, we were here 65 full days. My constituents, when I tell them that, it kind of starts making sense why we're so dysfunctional. We need more time to do our work, and we need to be scattered less. So one of the conversations we've had is to make a recommendation surrounding the ratio, the number of days that we are here full days versus the number of travel days. If we did a 2-week on, 2-week off schedule, we would actually be here 108 full days and we would travel 24 days, as opposed to last year where we were here 65 days and traveled 66 days. We spend a lot of time in the airport, and I think that time can be better spent if we find more opportunities to do our work here. In regard to the schedule, and at the end of this, I'm going to ask you your thoughts, by the way. So in regards to the schedule, we often have overlapping committees, subcommittees, floor votes. There's just overlapping obligations. As you can tell, someone already had to leave and had to go early because they had somewhere else to be. So if we can create a block schedule format that does not facilitate this overlapping obligations, and it will not be perfect because you're always going to have rules committee meeting at weird hours, and that's never going to change. But just anything we can do to minimize overlapping schedules. And then floor votes, I spent time with the parliamentarian's office. If we are here more, we can really nail down when we're going to be on the floor. And we say floor votes are from 5 to 6:30 and or from 1 to 1:30. Those are the only options. There's never going to be a situation where you're going to be like, floor votes might be in the next half hour. We might be there in 2 hours. So if we hear more, it would allow more predictability for floor votes, which I think would be an incredible amount of time we'd be giving back, in addition to the time we're earning with the calendar changes that we've proposed. So do y'all think that one of the problems we have with this issue we're talking about, ceding power to the executive branch, is that the process that we have is flawed, and if we worked on the calendar, the schedule, and floor votes, we could potentially spend more meaningful time getting back some of the legislative branch's power?
Yes. No, I mean, really, it's time on task. And the amount of time that is allocated for you all to be here, I mean, you can't have a hearing when you're home. That's contracted. And when you're here, I often use the phrase Swiss cheesing. Your schedules get Swiss cheesed. Like, oh, by the way, you have to go to a fundraiser. So boom, there goes 2 hours of your life. Oh, by the way, you got to go over to the DNC, the RNC, and make some calls. Oh, by the way, you have to go do this sort of duty. And you just try to figure, like, how can you possibly do all you're supposed to do when all these other things are picking away at you? And figuring out ways to extend the time here, to reduce the time burnt in airports, but also the time that gets torched on stuff that's not really valuable. I mean, the after-hours speeches, some of the stuff that's at the start of the day. I mean, it's really valuable time, but it's not actually achieving a whole lot. And thinking about, can we nix some of that stuff so we can get more out of our schedule? Absolutely.
I'd also like to mention that when I talk to different offices about doing oversight, the members are pulled in so many directions that it's very hard to find time to focus in a concentrated way on documents or witnesses. You go to this hearing, maybe you're studying your stuff on the way over, you have a couple minutes before it's your turn to get called, and that shows when you have an oversight hearing and it's televised. A lack of preparation, unfamiliarity with documents, not because you're not conscientious, hardworking people, but simply you have too much going on, there's too much travel, there's too much time in airports. So yeah, and the other thing to think about is social interaction. What we found at our subcommittee, we had a rolling cocktail party for 15 years. Every 2 to 3 weeks, we would get together and have drinks with the other party. And the reason we did that is we found that it strengthened our social fabric. It encouraged people to see each other as real people with common interests, and we started to find our social fabric got better, and we were able to partner better. It's very hard to partner with people that you don't know and that you only see in passing in the hallway. And that's very true for staff, and I think it's true for members as well. So if you had 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, there might actually be opportunities for people to get to know each other, and that would improve bipartisanship as well.
I couldn't agree with you more. That was actually how I was going to close it, because I think we do not have enough opportunities to build relationships with our colleagues across the aisle, and I think that is part of the problem. But with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to associate myself with Mr. Timmons' remarks. I spend more time in the Detroit airport than I do in the Madison, Wisconsin office on a weekly basis, and the restaurant I go to the most often is the Delta Sky Club rather than anything in my district as far as frequency. So, we spend an awful lot of time, when you live in a smaller airline market, it takes me sometimes, it's taken me up to 14 hours to do what is a 12-hour drive from Wisconsin and flying, and that's all time you're not here actually doing your job. So I just want to echo those. My questions are around staffing, both on the input and the output side. On the input side, we pay remarkably low for an expensive town. The best way to get a job here is to be an intern. Best way to get an intern was until recently to work for nothing, now to work for next to nothing. Which right away decides who can come up here and probably get jobs. And then when you finally get that staff assistant job, you make $30,000. A one-bedroom apartment is $30,000 a year, about on average. It's just impossible. So there's an input problem we have on staff, which kind of self-selects a little bit. And then on the output side, I recently had a communication staff leave, and they took a job just writing op-eds, and they're making, we said, is there anything we can do financially? And they're like, well, I'm making 50 cents on the dollar of my new offer that they got. And it's really hard to keep people in that longer level. Some of it's salary, but some of it is the career path issue that you brought up. We just don't have the same thing. So on those two parts of employment, the input side and the output side, what are some extra suggestions that we could be looking at? I mean, obviously the pay issue is, there's no question, that's kind of, I think, a universal, but what else can we be doing to help on that career path and on who comes in here to make sure we have, as diverse as our districts, we have people coming to work up here, so it's not just people who are coming already from an economically advantaged viewpoint?
Well, two things on the input. First of which is, last year, Congress decided that they were actually going to put aside a little bit of money to be able to pay interns. And I think that's valuable, but the amount that was provided really is not sufficient to help somebody who's a person of means and able to be here anyway versus one who is not. So I think rethinking that policy and asking whether it needs to be upped. The second is the housing issue. I mean, that's the real cost. I mean, staffers they're dedicated, tough bunch. They have to get buying ramen noodles and whatever. I mean, they'll cut costs as necessary, but if the only place they can live is a place where they're going to get stuck with a high bill, that's an issue. And one of the things that I've marveled at for years is that we have the old Page dorm sitting on Capitol Hill, unbelievably valuable asset, sitting there empty. Why can't that be converted into housing? Or why can't that be privatized and sold off and the value of that put towards dealing with the problem in some way, shape, or form? It's just sitting there. So figuring out a way to deal with the housing thing, to defer the cost of housing, to reduce the cost of housing, I think that would be a huge help as far as getting folks here who might not otherwise be able to afford it.
I'd also like to mention the oversight field. Often you like to have a lawyer. And when I was on the subcommittee, we were able to hire lawyers. Most I could offer was like $85,000. So the people I was hiring were willing to take a more than 50% cut to come work here because the work is so interesting and important. So people are willing to work for less, but how long can they do it? And their spouses are complaining, and after, 3, 4, 5 years, they're like, I just can't do it anymore. I have to pay for college, and so they take off. We know about that problem. One thing that can help, I think, is training. The Levin Center, working with POGO and the Lugar Center, we do these boot camps twice a year for staff. We get House, Senate, Democrat, Republican. We put them on bipartisan, bicameral teams, give them fake scandals, and then take them through the process. And they learn not only investigative skills, but also how you work with people who have very different views than your own, and you find out that there's actually a value to that rather than a penalty. And I think one of the things that staffs really have told us is they don't like working in environments that are very partisan, where everybody is supposed to hate each other. That is not pleasant for staff. They want to work in a place where you're allowed to have bipartisan relationships. You are allowed to work with the other side. And I've seen it on both sides of the aisle where the members of Congress have forbidden their staff to sign letters on any issue with the other side or to sort of fraternize with the enemy. So I think one thing is a change in how members see it, and making a public commitment to bipartisan fact-based oversight would actually make staff a lot happier. When they come to our training, they enjoy working with the other side. It challenges them, they find it interesting, but it's hard to find that environment on the Hill.
If I could add one thing, which is I think there's some instructive examples in the executive branch. So I've had a lot of former students join the Presidential Management Fellowship, as well as the Pathways program, which is a program that students can intern in college and then after they graduate get hired in the executive branch. And I bring these programs up because they give an introduction. You're getting great people, but they get great people and they get them to stay. Because they're getting training. So they might do a rotation in different parts of the executive branch, and they're really getting exposure. So some of those models might be borrowed from the executive and pretty neatly applied to the legislative branch.
If I could really quickly, Congressman, I agree with Dr. Potter completely. I think one of the challenges that exists in the Congress is not looking to other models about how to get this right, whether it's the executive branch or whether it's private business. Within the Congress, I think a lot of people see staffing as 435 small businesses, right? They don't see Congress as a large institution, like a large corporation, that you can take lessons from about how we do professional development, how we do staff relations, how we think about something as basic as a feedback loop within an institution to understand what can be improved and where fixes need to happen. Whether you even continue to think about the Congress as 435 small businesses, maybe you think of them as like franchises. How does a company like Starbucks or McDonald's or Subway allow individual units to have freedom, to have some level of autonomy, but put in some sort of basic requirements that each has to do and that an overarching organization can help support? That's going to be one of the ways that you improve staff relations and staff development and keep people within the institution.
Thank you. Yield back.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see my good buddy, Mr. Pocan, went ahead and took your recommendation for more time for questioning the witnesses, Ms. Bean. It was a good job. Way to go. That was a little sly, buddy. It was sly.
Don't give it up on his time.
Yeah. No. I think it's a great recommendation for committees this size and for the committee that I'm the ranking member on, that Ms. Lofgren chairs, the House Administration Committee. 5 minutes of questioning is not enough for us to do not only proper questioning of witnesses during a hearing, but proper oversight. I mean, I can't get the questions asked for each of the agencies that we have. I like that. But I will tell you, Ms. Lofgren and I work together to do second and third rounds of questions. So a lot of this stuff can be easily solved at the committee level. You know, if you had a cooperative chair who I would ask for extra time, but he wouldn't give it to me today. So, right? If I asked for unanimous consent, my colleagues would all object, I guarantee it. But I'm also the ranking member on the largest subcommittee in Congress, Highways and Transit. I've got 59 members. Now, you use the Intelligence Committee during the impeachment process as kind of an example of what to do. I don't necessarily know if that would be a good idea on a committee like ours, because that process empowered the staff and the members didn't get to ask as many questions, and they were still pushed for time. We can't add to the time of questions, and I think a lot of it has to do on the social media side. You know, you got a committee of 59 members. By the time we get down to the end, we're asking the same questions again, not because they want the committee to hear the answers, because they want to post something on social media. That's a problem too. So that's something to think about. But thank you for your recommendation. Dr. Hudak, I'm glad you brought up congressionally directed spending, earmarks, whatever you want to call it. I was a staffer back in the day when the process became much more transparent. What would it take for this institution to allow for congressionally directed spending to happen again? Would it be statutory, rule changes? What's your research show?
So right now, the ban on earmarks exists because of formal or informal agreements within the caucuses and conferences within the House and Senate.
So it wouldn't even take a statutory issue.
It wouldn't even require a rules change.
So there were people who made bad decisions before the era of transparency. I remember we used to have to post all of the requests online. Now, if you look at just the last year of congressionally directed spending back then that they called earmarks, and you went to what was publicly available, put up on each member's website. Has anybody done any research in the years since those existed to actually see what the outcome of those requests were? To see if the benefit that was put up on the website of a member actually came to the communities? I mean, I can show you areas that I'm now proud to represent that have projects that have really helped us grow economically in certain areas that started with an earmark, highway project, another, other types of projects. So it'd be telehealth was started with an earmark in my boss's old district, and now it's everywhere. Those are things that I think don't get out enough. It's where do you guys stand, Mr. Hudak, in helping us compile the research to talk about the good things that actually happen?
One of the best advertisers of earmarks are members of Congress themselves. You're working hard to get something through, and you are going to be the first person, rightly so, to help sell this to the public by saying, this is what we've done, this is the project that we're funding, this is the new, the new technology that is going to help be helped because of what Congress is doing.
I understand that, but every time a member of Congress tries to sell the benefits of a project, there's somebody on the other side, and in a political nature, and sometimes in outside groups that may be on your side traditionally, that will find a reason why it's not a good investment. Heck, there may be members of the Senate that put together books that tell how these are not good investments.
Yes.
My point is, what are institutions, what are associations like yours and groups like yours, what are you doing to help talk about whether that was a good investment or not? We can say it till we're blue in the face. We can talk about what it means to our communities, but has anybody done any substantive research on whether or not the last round of earmarks or another round actually helped the communities that they said they were going to help when they offered their transparency on their website when requesting that money?
So there's certainly research that shows the economic benefits of congressionally directed spending, and I can get you a list of some of that research after the hearing. One of the challenges with the period of time that you're discussing, Mr. Davis, is that period of transparency was actually quite narrow in time, right? The movement
Might be easier to study.
It makes it a little harder to study in terms of having fewer cases to look at. And so if we had a 10 or 15
I think there's enough in that last year.
Surely there's enough to conduct studies. My point is, if we can have an additional period of time in which we have transparency, where we can look at this more rigorously across time, across space, across programs, the many ways that you can chop up congressionally directed spending, we're going to have a better idea of that impact. We're also going to have a better idea of the value of the transparency, whether it's actually doing what it's supposed to or not. What Congress has done, however, has limited research in this space by shifting from let's say a Wild West version of earmarking to a transparent version of earmarking to an environment now where earmarking, frankly, still exists in some ways. It just happens behind closed doors. It happens in the shadows. And so the worst part of the earmark ban, I would argue, is that it drove all of this into the shadows and removed any transparency that existed in the process. And those who are in powerful positions, those who are committee chairs and others have the ability to slip language in the right ways, in a way that a freshman member of Congress or a backbencher is just not able to do. And what else is not possible is for research organizations and media to be able to track that issue as effectively and do the kinds of research that you're talking about as well.
Thank you. If I had more time, I'd ask you, Dr. Kosar, if committee chairs, when they were more powerful, had a better grasp on the oversight process. But I'm out of time until we get your suggestion.
I'd like the record to show that you were out of time 2 minutes ago. Next, Mr. Cleaver.
Yeah, but he was right. He is right. I support that. a couple of things. You know, first of all, you know, with the media, and then we always overreact. I counted. I was here. Zoe and I were here. Well, actually, you were here when we did earmarks. We had 3 people who got in trouble. 3 out of 435 and 16 years. And it was horrible. It was just the worst thing in it. 3 people. And they're all in prison, which is what's supposed to happen. So I think we take it way past the logic. And today, we were told that Mr. DeFazio is going to begin the process of putting the transportation bill together. This used to be a time everybody was, hallelujah. I mean, Republicans, Democrats dancing, kissing, you know, just this was like, you know, this is the time to be saved. And so all of a sudden, you know, it's just blasé, because everybody knew that little bridge in their community that's been falling in for 45 years can get fixed. And I think it's an embarrassment that we can't do this. The Missouri delegation had lunch today. Every single one of us, when I was asked to give a report, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, said, are you guys going to submit earmarks, and can you do it now, like today? I mean, everybody. We had one senator over, and he wouldn't mind me using his name, Roy Blunt, a good friend of mine. And I think we did damage. I think it was 2010, Mr. Huddock, you may remember, President Obama, for whom I served as a national co-chair for his reelection, said during his speech, I will not sign any more bills with earmarks in it. The next day, I was quoted in newspapers all over the country saying the president is out of line, that's not his responsibility. I don't care if he's a Democrat or a cleaver. That's out of line. That's our responsibility. It's our constitutional responsibility. So it leads me to the thing that I don't know if we can get addressed, and that is, I think human beings may be psychologically hardwired for tribalism. You do it on the basis of kinship, and then, you know, facial features, football teams. We're just hardwired, and so there has to be intentionality for us to dewire it, and I think that's where the problem lies, because as long as we're tribal, even if we don't like, I mean, President Obama, I mean, he'll tell you, I'd vote for him again. Whenever he went south, I didn't go south with him, and I don't care today, whether somebody says, well, you weren't loyal to the president. I'm loyal to those 800,000 people in my congressional district. When Kit Bond retired, I was a keynote speaker at his retirement dinner. He's a Republican from my home, and one of my dearest friends. When I was mayor, he'd come sit down with me, sit down with the mayor of St. Louis and say, we're getting ready to do earmarks. What are the things that you guys are interested in? And I just think we're bypassing the opportunity to really do stuff for our community. We have earmarks now. You're absolutely right, except they're done in the White House. Obama did them, Bush did them, and Trump's doing them. And we're the ones sitting over here, talking about they're taking our power. We gave it away. Anyway, that's my sermon. Just say amen, let's move on. I'm through.
Actually, before I yield to Ms. Brooks, just on the point that Mr. Cleaver just made, Mr. Hudak, or Dr. Hudak, so you wrote a book about this, right? About how not only the authority has been given to the executive, but how that has gone. Sure. So can you take a minute or so and just talk about, so how's it worked with the executive branch running the show? Has it all been sunshine and rainbows, or has that authority been abused?
Sure. Mr. Cleaver, thanks for your remarks. They were spot on, both about the history of earmarks and I think the bipartisan support for that type of the participation in those behaviors. In the executive branch, there's far less transparency about earmarking, which is problematic, certainly vis-a-vis where the Congress was before the ban went into effect. And what happens within federal agencies is that there is an easy understanding of where a president's political interests are. They are making sure that swing states get a lot of money and that those swing states get a lot of money, particularly in advance of an election. This is not some complex political dynamic that some agencies get right and some agencies get wrong. This is very easy and does not need to be telegraphed. You don't need the president to be pulling the strings. You don't need meetings to be held. Everyone knows what presidents are interested in, and presidents of both parties are interested in the same thing. And so what the research shows is that, yes, when given the opportunity, the executive branch does not direct all the funding to swing states, obviously, but there is strong statistical evidence that you are looking at additional tens to hundreds of millions of dollars being directed to swing states in given years. And who is losing out on that? Again, it's not growing the pie. You guys set the size of the pie. What happens is if you're from a non-swing state, you're from Washington or you're from Georgia, although maybe Georgia's going to be cashing in soon, I don't know, you're not going to be doing as well as a Florida or a Michigan or a Wisconsin. And so that is politics interfering with at least part of the distribution decisions over federal funds. Now, if we take for granted that politics is going to be part of it, I think most Americans would far prefer that their member of Congress be engaged in those politics than a president or a bureaucrat who's directing money in a variety of different places, but certainly not back to the 45-year-old bridges in Missouri that need repair this year.
Thank you. Mrs. Brooks. And thank you for your flexibility in letting us do that there.
Mr. Chair, the time is yours. So whatever is so important. Thank you all so much for being here. I don't have the history that my good friend from across the aisle has, but it's interesting that he reminds us that only three people, but it was three people who essentially, caused Congress and the American public to shift dramatically in how they thought about earmarks. I'm afraid that many of us come here, and while I'm in my 8th year here, we come here and are often told at the beginning that we are 435 kind of independent offices and small businesses, and we don't view it as the institution. Now, I got placed in my first term by Speaker Boehner on the House Ethics Committee, then became chair of the House Ethics Committee last Congress, but the House Ethics Committee is all about the institution. And it is a bipartisan committee, it is evenly divided, and it focuses on the House rules and protecting the institution, not individual members. But yet, often in campaigns, Congress as an institution gets bashed all the time. We are constantly, as political parties and as members, bashing even the office we're trying to run for. And so I'm curious, and I'll start with you, Dr. Kosar, how do we sell capacity building to the American public about us investing in our offices and in ourselves, not ourselves personally, but in our staffs and so forth, when they truly believe we have far more than we need? No one believes we need more staff. No one that I know of. No one, most of my constituents don't say, I need a nicer office or I need staff who are paid more, and they really don't care how much it costs to live in Washington, D.C., how much it costs members, how much it costs anybody. So how do we sell capacity when, as to the investments you all believe we need to be making in our institution? Start with you.
Sure. No, it's a wicked hard problem. And the polling data are pretty clear that, members of the public tend to think Congress is overstaffed, which is, it is what it is. I would say the first thing would be to consider couching capacity investments in terms of better customer service. You got tons of constituent outreach coming to you. You're constantly harassed for being out of touch. That's the accusation. You're not paying enough attention. You're not responsive enough. Well, we can be more responsive if we have better systems and we have more people who are able to deal with this crush of communications. So there's that aspect. The second thing is to perhaps let them know that financial savings can actually occur when you have better oversight. GAO frequently likes to tout the fact that it can save the government a lot of money by identifying waste, fraud, abuse, et cetera, and bringing them to light. If GAO is not doing that, you guys can't act and zero something out. And so there's also that part of it. Candidly, though, I think a lot of the capacity investments are going to have to be done in a way that's just not politically salient. I mean, if you say, for example, that, yes, members of Congress are going to be able to shift the cost of, say, student loan reimbursement from out of their personal pot of money into kind of a collective office in the House, nobody in America is going to pay attention to that. It's just too complicated, it's not interesting, it's not salient, but the practical effect of that means that you have more dollars to spend on the staff that you have, and you might be able to increase retention.
Thank you. Or any other ideas?
I just want to mention, I think that you pointed out that one of the basic problems that members of Congress bash Congress. If you had the airlines talking about how dangerous they are and all of the problems with them, people wouldn't want to fly, and you wouldn't be able to get the investments that you need for safe aviation. So part of the problem is with Congress itself to say that we actually do an important function here. Oversight, I think, is part of it. Waste, fraud, and abuse. In my subcommittee, we actually kept track for a while of how much money we saved, and it was well over $1 billion. And we're like, if we could only have 1% of the money that we've saved, it would be worth it. But right now, Congress does not value itself enough to make the investments needed to make it effective. And when you have ratings as low as they are with the public, what's going on now isn't working. We need to do something else. We need to talk about Congress in a respectful way, its constitutional obligations, and make the investments that we need for Congress to operate in a better way.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks. Let me recognize myself. Let me start with Dr. Kosar. So the data you provided about congressional staffing levels, I want to pull on this thread that Ms. Brooks had. How do you explain that the staffing levels in the Senate remain relatively steady in contrast to what seems like a pretty big drop in the House?
Well, it was a deliberate choice in the early 1990s. When you look at the Senate in the 1980s, you look at the House in the 1980s, the Senate had a pretty good reputation. The House, it was a little bit wild. There was ABSCAM, there was a whole bunch of bad things happening, the House banking scandal. There was a lot of stuff that was going wrong. It's also the case that the staff that were there at the time were not always well used. Congress kind of went on a hiring binge in the early 70s, 80s, and you had this cresting and a lot of staff running around, and you did end up with members in the House particularly saying that staff are getting in the way. Some of these guys are getting big heads. You know, it was the sort of thing you would predict would happen when there was this massive influx of new employees and no systems to really manage them particularly well. And so it provoked a reaction. Newt Gingrich was quite adroit in pointing out that things were not running properly, and when Republicans took Congress, they rolled out a banner that said under new management. It was addressing the popular concern that the House had turned into Animal House. The Senate didn't have that sort of salient scandal situations. I mean, there was pages. I mean, there was all sorts of bad things happening in the House that invited this.
I also want to I want to get at this issue. Clearly, self-flagellation is more popular than investment in the institution. And I'm just trying to think through methods through which this committee could look at capacity building. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to, so it's one thing to just, we could direct the Ledge Branch Appropriations Subcommittee to, try to get the institution more in line with the Senate or with the executive branch. We could kick it to a third-party entity, say, form a blue ribbon panel on institutional capacity, and within 5 years, try to get to their mark. I'm just, you understand, I'm just throwing out ideas there. If you were on this committee, what would you recommend? Acknowledging the tricky dynamic that Mrs. Brooks asked about.
Well, I think I would first consider, I mean, yeah, you want to increase capacity, and particularly I think there's a value in doing it and increasing capacity in the form of staff. But where do you put those staff? I think it does not look great if you just say, well, we're going to put a whole bunch more in my personal office. But if you start saying, well, we're going to increase the quantity of FTEs who are at CRS or CBO, nobody outside this town is going to get particularly upset about that. And in fact, that sort of stuff has been happening. There have been increases in the appropriations to these agencies, and nobody, as far as I could tell, is getting clobbered in the polls because of it. So that would be, one way to look at doing it. And committees also. Again, it's very hard to be accused of you are, hiring a new limo driver or something because you're putting new personal staff on. If you're tucking this expertise in committee and you're kind of hitting the notes of oversight, that this will strengthen oversight, I think you're going to be largely insulated from the sort of backlash you might face.
I'd like to agree with that on the committees, virtually every committee is required by law to do oversight within the jurisdiction they've been given. And people want their government to work better. They worry about waste, fraud, and abuse. You cannot get your government to work better unless you have good oversight. You can't do good oversight unless there's more staff and more resources to focus on the executive branch and all the things that are going on there and the other real problems that are facing us. The other thing I'll say is that if you want to do this stuff in a bipartisan way, bipartisan investigations take longer. They're harder because you challenge each other, you have to work through the issues. You can't have 12 hearings a year. My subcommittee had 2 to 3 hearings a year, but we spent an entire year on it, we got to agreement, and then we were able to tackle some problems. So I'd have fewer hearings, I'd have less partisan topics, and I would justify that additional money as in terms of trying to address the problems that we all know our government has. Even in a good government, there's always problems. And if Congress doesn't do the oversight, they're not going to get fixed.
Mr. Chairman, if I could very quickly. I think part of the responsibility here also rests with leadership. I think for the Speaker, the Minority Leader, and the heads of the campaign committees to effectively call a truce about what you said, attacking the institution and saying we are going to hold our members to account, that if there is a valid critique about what is happening, let that valid critique be aired out. But if there is a proposal from members or votes from members to increase the capacity of this institution, that needs to be politically off limits. Now, that might be fantastical, the idea that a truce like that could hold, but if it keeps 75% of the members in line around that, it's going to be part of a discipline system that would need to be enacted from a political perspective in concert with trying to change the internal policies of the Congress.
Let me recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes, and then we'll do a second round if time permits. And if you aren't all sweated out of this room, it's, for those watching on C-SPAN, it's 9,000 degrees in here. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the benefit of the millions of viewers, let me say what they can't see is that for a better, an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half, this room was packed with participants wanting to learn about, in fact, standing room only at one point, all committee members in attendance, which is rare in this place unless there is something more high profile going on. So it's a compliment to this panel for sure, and to the subject matter and the importance of it. So, Mr. Chairman, thanks for doing this committee hearing in this way. I wanted just to, Dr. Hudak, talk for a second about what you were speaking of. You were phrased a minute ago when you were talking about, you used the term earmarks, which is an older term, and I think if we're ever to transition back to what you referred to as not a practice but our constitutional duty, it probably has to be modified in a way that's much more responsible and accepting. Politically, there are certain challenges, but you've heard broad support amongst this committee, and I think even committee members have expressed broad support from other groups within the various parties. But there is a political aspect to it, and I would be interested in each of the panel's perspectives on his comments and this restoration of this power. But what you did emphasize that was obvious to me, but yet I hadn't noticed it, is that it doesn't change the amount of spending that occurs in this place. It just redirects how you might spend it. And in fact, it's a little bit sharper of a pencil, so to speak, as to how we might operate. But to get a unique perspective, I just happened to notice the tie on Dr. Kozar here, an Adam Smith tie, if I might note right, which would lead me to think, again, no stereotypes, but you might be more center-right fiscally thinking. What is your response, or what are your perspective on the proposal, as it was mentioned earlier, in the restoration of this duty?
It makes perfect sense to me in terms of accountability. You know, if you're a member and you direct a bunch of spending on something that turns out to be a boondoggle, you're going to hear about it. You're going to get hammered. If it happens somewhere in the bowels of the Department of Transportation, no accountability whatsoever. It also, I think, for sure, nobody wants to go back to the days of Casino Jack and that sort of stuff. And that's very easy to prevent from happening. But the whole conversation around earmarks is very anchored, as Representative Cleaver noted, on the few bad things that happened. And Mr. Davis mentioned that the positive is not often talked about. I mean, those are just not interesting stories. Media frequently don't pick them up. You might release a press release saying we did something good that helped back here. You might get a little bit of local coverage, but that is about all you get. But it's absolutely appropriate. And I would like to see some sort of, and to be honest, congressionally directed spending happens all the time. Every time you draw up a formula in law, even if it's collectively bargained across two different chambers, somebody's going to get more than others. But we don't call that earmarking. Well, why? You know? So let's, yeah.
No, thanks for your perspective, because I think you're right. I mean, and I don't think anyone on this panel would agree that we need to go back to the way it was. I think there is a genuine intent to try to understand how do you restore an Article I action and remove power from the executive branch and restore it back in the legislative branch in a way that is noted as and known as and will be seen as responsible and guarded, protected, transparent, and you've shared a few good concepts with us today that might help with that. I know this is my last term, but I suspect that someday in the future, Mr. Chairman, whether we address this, some other Congress will. And I don't know how they might address that, but I hope that the spirit of this committee and what we have learned and what we've seen will really lean into this to try to find a responsible solution as we move forward. But would you have any thoughts on this? Is this something you've put any thoughts towards, or have any recommendations to us of how we might, repurpose, rebrand, and provide a better process for the American people?
So I can't say that I have recommendations, but I wanted to make 2 points. One is returning to Dr. Hudak's excellent book. He has a long time series in that book, and he shows us that presidentially directed spending happens. An important part about that is that his time series starts way before the earmark ban that we're talking about, right? So this presidentially directed spending has been around, and it's probably going to stay around. It's not something that it's going to be easy to change. So that's one thing, is that's kind of something that there's only earmarks account for congressionally directed spending account for about 1% of spending when they were in place. So it's a very small portion. So the executive branch is probably still going to retain some authority here, for better or worse. And I think that in thinking about this, you might think about how to bring earmarks back in a more targeted way, right? So not just saying congressionally directed spending, yes or no, but can we put it in places where it makes sense, where you can bring members' expertise about their districts to bear? Maybe large infrastructure projects, as we've already talked about, might be a really good place, and there might be other types of programs where congressionally directed spending is less appropriate, perhaps.
Ms. Bean, any thoughts?
I also support bringing back congressionally directed spending, not only because it's a constitutional obligation, but also because it actually promotes bipartisanship. When you have to be transparent about your earmarks, there has to be a meeting of the minds of the people on the Appropriations Committee. It's all out there in the public, and you're going to make some decisions. And, you know, if this one's going to let you do it, you're going to have to, you know, there's going to be some trading back and forth and say, well, if I want my bridge in my district and there's all this, you know, support for it and research behind it, and there's something similar in your district, let's both go forward. So I think it actually promotes bipartisanship as well. And I was here when we had that whole process, and it moved a lot of bills forward. Transportation, as Mr. Cleaver said, used to be a very happy time instead of a very painful time now.
And Dr. Hudak, just to sort of close here, I know you've given a great explanation of, and you have great knowledge of the past of earmarks, the presidential earmarks. Do you have any experience on, as it relates to grants? You know, when I think about earmark term or congressionally directed spending, I wonder why we don't have the same conflict when we talk about Tiger grants or community block grants or other grants that Congress funds and provides and moves forward. There doesn't seem to be that same, you know, negativity about it. And why is that?
I think Dr. Kosar is right. These are perfect examples of pork in a different, packaged in a different format, block grants, formula grants, et cetera. I think because the benefits are widespread by nature of a formula or a block grant, it is harder for an individual member to attack. And it is easier then for an individual constituent to understand the benefits to the district. But at the same time, because earmarks typically around federal grants are very specific, they're project-oriented funding streams, it is easy for one person not necessarily to recognize the benefit to the district of that individually. Now, as a whole, as a sum of their parts, a lot of constituents are going to benefit from this type of spending. But I think part of the challenge too, I'm typically not one for splitting hairs around naming things, but I think you're right. Earmarking has just been blacklisted, essentially, as a term. I also think congressionally directed spending is not something that's terribly palatable because the onus is on you. And if Congress as an institution, as Mrs. Brooks said, is in the gutter, in the basement, congressionally directed spending isn't going to be that helpful either. What it is constituent-focused spending. The beneficiaries are not you. The beneficiaries are your constituents. And I think framing things in a more individual, public, constituent-oriented conversation is much easier. As one of my panelists said before about building capacity, frame it as customer service. That's what your district offices do. That's what some of your staff here does. That's easier for an individual constituent to understand the benefits of that then, rather than this being the focus on the member or the focus even on the institution. And I think it's true for project grants as well.
Great, thank you. Very insightful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. We have a few members who have some follow-up questions if you're not sweating too bad. Ms. Brooks.
To ask Ms. Bean about your idea of an Office of Legal Counsel. I'm a former United States attorney, so relied on those OLC opinions from the Justice Department. Justice Department being, you know, an institution within the executive branch. How would you see? When I came here, I was amazed when I heard that, say, a Republican Party was hiring lawyers and filing lawsuits, and the Democrat Party now, you know, files against the executive branch now. And how would you see an Office of Legal Counsel functioning, and what type of work would you see them actually doing? And I know we certainly have nonpartisan staff. That's what we hire in the Ethics Committee. I assume the parliamentarian, that's nonpartisan staff. The Sergeant-at-Arms are nonpartisan staff. I don't know about House Admin. I think there's still partisan staff, but there aren't many offices within Congress that are nonpartisan staff. And so I'm just curious, that's the first time I'd ever thought of that. It certainly makes some sense. But what kind of issues or problems would you see an OLC for Congress? Would it be for the primary reason of debating OLC at Justice? Or what, I just had not thought about that, and thank you for all of the focus on bipartisanship. I obviously come from Indiana, the home state of Senator Lugar, and love the work of the Bipartisan Center, and we miss him dearly. But can you just share with me a little bit more about what you think or what has been proposed on an OLC type of office?
I think it is very important that any legal opinions have bipartisan support. That's number one. If they don't have bipartisan support and it's not on behalf of Congress, it's going to open up a new can of worms. There are different ideas about how to get to bipartisan, thoughtful, well-supported legal opinions. Some people say the Office of the General Counsel is the place to do it because their whole reason for being is to defend Congress as an institution. So they're really and they have to go to court, and they're the ones in all of these court cases going on right now defending the right of Congress to get information. And that's how I'm looking at it in terms of oversight, that the legal opinions we need, the ones I'm thinking about, are enabling Congress to get information. So that's one possibility. Some people say, well, you should use CRS, that they have a tradition of being not partisan at all, and they would be the right place to do this. Other people respond, well, CRS is an academic institution. They're not in the courts. They don't know what you need to really win the cases in courts. So, you know, there's pluses and minuses for those two options. I'm sure there could be other options as well. But one of the things the Levin Center is doing right now with the help of other institutions like the Lugar Center is we are actually launching a website next week gathering all of the information about a dozen cases that are going through the courts that have to do with Congress trying to get information, and usually the administration, but sometimes private sector parties fighting those information requests, and trying to create a one-stop shopping place where you can find out the information about what's going on in the courts. And there's a lot going on in the courts, and it is overwhelmingly favorable to Congress as opposed to the administration. But not many people know about that. They don't know there's more than a dozen judges from all different perspectives that support Congress in its ability to get information. But in all of those court cases, I'm reading all those pleadings, OLC comes up all the time with their opinions, where they're just saying, well, we've had this opinion for 50 years that White House counsel shouldn't have to respond to congressional subpoenas. Congress says, well, we have two judges that have said they should, but they don't have that sort of bipartisan legal opinion. So I think your instinct is right that it needs to be bipartisan. I think the Office of General Counsel is one possibility, CRS is another.
How would you staff that?
Well, the same way the Office of General Counsel is staffed now. They have lawyers there. They're actually filing briefs in these dozen cases, lower court, appellate court, Supreme Court. They do amazing, fantastic work. I don't know how they're cranking out all this work, but as everybody in Congress does, they just get the job done despite the difficulty.
All right, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had two questions. So one is where the inflection point is on reclaiming some of this power. As the chair and ranking member explained, this hasn't been a talk about it committee. This has been a do something about it committee. So I wanted advice on when that opportunity to do something about it is. In my Republican primary in 2010, I campaigned in favor of congressional directed spending because I said, who do you trust more, Barack Obama or me? That was my time to win. I go home with that same line today. The answer is, Rob, we trust Donald Trump more than we trust you. And so I can't. The season. We've got to find the right season to make this work. Can you give me advice on when you believe the season is for reclaiming Article 1 power? I'll posit divided government is that time. Derek is the right leader, but other ideas.
I think it's a little bit easier at the start of a new presidency. I think there can be a conversation. To be frank, I've actually been floored by the lack of conversation within Democratic presidential debates that have not focused on what to do about the office of the president. There is a lot of complaints in the Democratic primary about what Donald Trump is doing. There are things that the president, courts have said, have crossed the line, but there's a lot of what the president is doing that stretches delegation from Congress in ways that we just haven't seen before. That problem, to be myopic and think that that is a Donald Trump problem, it is really dismissive of Congress as an institution. The problem is not the president. The problem is the presidency. And I think a broader conversation about the powers of the office that need to happen in both parties is important. Right now, in the partisan heat that we have, particularly involving the president and the institution, now is probably not the greatest time to have sort of a heave-ho moment, but certainly as the campaign rolls on, and whether the next president is elected this year or in 4 years, that is going to be an important moment to think about this. At the same time, and I should say that's for issues that would require overcoming a presidential veto. A Republican president and a Democratic president are probably equally going to try to veto these types of efforts. But there's a lot that can be done in congressional rules, in informal norms, and through a variety of processes within the institution that you don't need Donald Trump or Barack Obama or some other president to sign on to. And for those issues, now is the moment for that, not to wait for the next Congress to do it.
Any other counsel on that line? Dr. Kozar?
All I was going to say is one challenge that I have been wrestling with is how do we make the purse powerful again? I mean, it's the peculiar situation to John Q. Public to be looking and hearing folks say that we have an out-of-control presidency, it's grown crazily big. President can't reach into the Treasury and grab out the money he wants. It has to be appropriated by Congress. Yet somehow in the last 20, 30 years, the ability to use the purse to control action, whether it's simply saying, well, you did this, we're going to zero this out. Like, seems like that sort of thing is not happening, and I don't understand why that leverage has disappeared. Maybe it's the fear that if you try to place that sort of hold on things, you'll cock up the omnibus going through, and then the government will shut down and it'll be a pox on everyone's house. I'm not sure, but I think getting the power of the purse back so that it's effectual and that it can curb misuse. I mean, one of the great problems we have right now is that even places where it's not clear that Congress delegated power away, executive branch is doing stuff anyway. And how do you make them pay for it? And the purse seems to be the only option to me.
If I can stipulate that everyone supports reclaiming Article 1 authority, a strengthening legislative branch, to Ms. Bean's point about the Intelligence Committee hearing, that was a more cogent hearing than many that we've had. I would argue rank and file members were disadvantaged, committee leadership, House leadership advantaged. If our shared goal is increasing or restoring Article 1 responsibility, does that happen in your mind by increasing rank and file influence in the House, or does that happen by increasing leadership influence in the House? I know exactly how to make the Speaker more powerful. I know exactly how to make ranking members more powerful. I'm not sure which one helps me to balance my influence with Article 2 and 3.
Well, I would say in the case of hearings, those are controlled by the committees. Leadership is not running that hearing as the committee chair and the vice chair. And if they can have a more cogent hearing, more power to them, because you have millions of people watching. You don't want them to turn away and say, that was just painful to watch. You want them to say, well, I may agree or disagree, but those people are prepared, they're serious, they made their points. And simply having a little bit more time to do it is helpful. Now, does it empower the committee chairs and the committee leaders? Yes. But the rank and file, I mean, what they have to do is be willing to sit through that and stay longer. Senator Levin was famous for his very long hearings. His record was 11 hours. We started at 9 in the morning and we finished at, 11 o'clock at night, because he wanted to give every member as much time as they wanted to ask whatever questions they wanted. Now, that's not easy. It can be very difficult with your schedules and all the other demands on you. But that's one answer, is to have a cogent hearing. I mean, 45 minutes, I'd never actually seen that long before. I'd seen 15 minutes, 20 minutes per side, but I thought it worked well.
Stronger committee chairs equals stronger Article 1.
Yes, and stronger committees too, which I think is important. Now, the committees have lost a lot of power, and having better hearings makes the committee stronger.
Do the rest of you see that with clarity? Dr. Kozar?
Oh, yeah, certainly. I think the model that we've evolved towards, which is leadership-driven model, is become a trap. I mean, basically, your job as a member is to line up behind the leadership, or your job is to stand in opposition. And the notion that keeps getting put out there is, well, if we just do this, we'll be able to retain the majority forever. Well, we've seen the data since 1994, pinballing back and forth. The strategy is not a long-term governing strategy. And so when, Rs and Ds are clobbering each other year after year, and you keep turning seats over and moving people around and people coming in and people coming out, the executive branch just keeps on chugging.
I'd also like to point out that all of these suggestions we had for better oversight, bipartisan, fact-based oversight, none of them require statutes. None of them require the president to sign on. It's really under the control of Congress itself.
Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So a real easy question, just to end things. And Dr. Kozar, you just touched on it, so thank you for the good segue. I'm trying to sit here and think, okay, what's different or what's similar between the House and the Senate, or the House and the executive branch? Why have they been able to arguably be more successful at either maintaining or even growing their strength and power when the House hasn't? And I don't know if I have the answer or not. I want to throw that out to you. But when you talk about this conversation over the last few minutes, or back to the staff issues of continuity and career paths and effectiveness and all that, we literally stir everything up every 2 years. Is it as simple as or not a simple solution, but would it be a 2-year term? Does it lend itself to the House being as effective and as efficient and allow all those other good things to happen when you have to essentially change everything every 2 years? Or, I'm not suggesting the constitutional change, but if the executive branch has 4 years, Senate has 6 years, or can we do it otherwise? I don't know the whole history. I know 100 years ago we didn't have much staff. We didn't even have office buildings. A member's office was on the floor, their desk. And there's an old adage that government will grow into the space provided. We build an office building, guess what? Staff all of a sudden appear, and then another office building, then a third office building. So I'm not sure that's the answer, but any opinions on, can we do this? Is it just a matter of different choices were made in the House versus the Senate on why they've been able to be more successful?
Well, yeah, the 2-year election cycle is brutal. I mean, it sets very strong incentives to politic and to do things that are much more politically salient. And we're in a really peculiar era. For the longest time, 1900 through early 1980s, Democrats were always the majority. Republicans were always a minority. Thought that the Republicans could ever be the majority was considered fanciful. So people kind of got along in a very consensual way. That changed. And you know how it works. You get here and very quickly you're being told to think about how you're going to win the next election. Are you either going to take back the majority or get out of the minority, or send the others into the minority type thing. And the incentive structure is very strong that way, and in part, it goes back to the leadership-driven model. The idea is that, all power is at the top of the chamber, so whoever's at the top of the chamber gets to do everything, and we're going to, if we win that, then we can just ram our agenda down other side's throat. Again, it doesn't work. You got the Senate. The Senate, meanwhile, has a much more consensual model. It's a lot less majoritarian. The longer tenures, it just buffers them from this sort of stuff. Of course, it means that they often don't get things done as promptly as possible. Look at the appropriations process. The bills are just, you guys are hustling them through, and they go over there, and there they sit. There are costs with that. But yeah, it's at some point, the members are going to have to decide whether or not they want to keep the leadership-driven model, because otherwise this is going to perpetuate itself. There's just no way that it's not going to. The logic of the situation is if all authority rests with leadership, then of course there's going to be a vicious scrum to grab that authority.
I would also mention this whole thing about we now have for the foreseeable future very narrow majorities. And for the majority to get 2/3 of the committee funding and the minority to get 1/3 just leads to partisan anger and backlash. You have staff fired and staff brought back, and people put in, committee offices with no windows, and then, you just see these things sort of spin out. If in the Senate, you know, that committee funding reflects the majority. So if you have 51-49, you get 51% of the funding. And if it flips the next year, so it's 49-51, you lose a little bit, as you should, but it's not these sort of dramatic, partisan, punitive sort of actions. So it does mean that the majority party gives up some money, but on the other hand, when things flip, you know, and the other thing is what happened in the Senate when we actually made the transition from the 1/3, 2/3 to the more 41, you know, reflecting the actual majority. What happened is everybody kept the funding that they had, so nobody lost money, and they just added whatever was necessary to bring those amounts of money into parity. So that's how they've done it in the Senate, and it has led to a much less partisan situation, and also you don't lose institutional staff the way you used to.
Dr. Potter?
If I could bring some political science research to bear on this question. What we know about term limits, right, is that when states enact term limits, what we see is a reduction in expertise in the legislature and also a greater influence for lobbyists, right? So if we take that and we apply that to thinking about longer term limits for members of the House, right, we'd probably expect to see an increase in capacity and expertise in the House, certainly. But I think we have to return to the principle of why we have two-year terms, and that's really, this is the people's chamber. Keeping that in mind, right, can we build capacity in other ways, right, while still keeping this important principle that was from our founding?
Thank you. And by the way, I've counted 5 mentions of the book, so, yeah.
This committee is killing it on Amazon. Before we wrap, Dr. Hudak, I wanted to just ask one final question of you. Obviously, a lot of the conversation has been around appropriations. I think we all know the role that appropriations has in funding decisions, but appropriations isn't the only committee that's engaged in earmarking. To Mr. Cleaver's point, historically, when a transportation authorizing bill came out, people would all look at that as opportunity. Authorizing committees have had a role as well. I just want to get your sense of that. Do you think that good thing that authorizing committees were engaged in that as well? Bad thing? Did it make legislation more bipartisan? What should this committee take away from the role of those other committees outside of just appropriations?
I think having authorizing committees involved in that process, transportation is one, defense is another, homeland security, et cetera, that spreads around to the Congress the ability to engage in that action, to deliver for your constituents, and it doesn't then put up the several dozen appropriators onto a pedestal to whom everyone else in the Congress needs to go to in order for their constituents to be served. And so when you start to have, or you return to having authorizing committees, engaged in this process, it requires both more members to be involved, more members to have access to that system, but then also for even greater cooperation than already exists between the authorizing committees and the relevant subcommittees and the authorizing committees and the broader appropriations committee. All of that is cooperation in action. All of that requires members to get together, think together, and work together. And I think any way that you can increase that within this institution is a way to improve the institution as a whole.
Mr. Graves has a follow-up on that.
Just follow up on that point. So a large part of the federal government is being funded but not authorized, has not been reauthorized. Is it your thought then that no congressionally directed spending or grants, whatever you want to call it, earmarks, were to take place without authorization, and just because something is authorized, does that mean that the funds would be released?
It's certainly an interesting sort of hostage-taking approach to improving authorization, and I don't mean that pejoratively, though I'm not pro-hostage taker either. But I do think when you look out at some of the most contentious fights around reauthorizations over the past decade, especially FAA, you really understand how the failures of public policy can present really serious safety challenges for Americans, create industry disruptions where government shouldn't be disrupting industry. And putting those two together as part of the process and making one dependent on the other, I think facilitates policymaking in this country. And as you pointed out, when you have huge numbers of agencies on temporary reauthorizations, including the Department of Agriculture, you have to worry, where does that end, right? What agencies that or departments that seem protected from this are only protected for so long, and what kind of havoc does that create, as I said, in business, in policy, and for everyday Americans? And so I think that's a really creative way to think about forcing the hand of individual members and committees in general by bringing congressionally directed spending back and using it in fairly innovative ways.
In a way in which, I think what I'm hearing you suggest is that, and we're both appropriators here, we have a few appropriators on this panel actually, but that appropriators shouldn't have that sole power. That maybe a congressionally directed spending should not be appropriated without an appropriate authorization alongside of it. Is that what you're suggesting, or?
I certainly think that's an approach. I think it's going to be a really hard sell on the Appropriations Committee, but I do think that that is one additional means to check. I talked earlier about having different institutions within the Congress ensure greater accountability. That's certainly one way to have greater accountability. The one thing that you know about an appropriator on, say, the Defense Subcommittee is that they do not sit also on the Authorizing Committee. And so it is an automatic check on an earmark if you're requiring that to happen. Again, politically, probably a difficult sell. Institutionally and functionally, I think probably something that would be helpful in at least restoring Americans' trust or additional trust in that process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
This was really meaty. Thank you. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. I want to thank the Ways and Means Committee for letting us squat in their room. Thank you to the C-SPAN cameraman. Thank you for sweating with us in here, and to the person doing the transcription. Thank you. And to our committee staff for putting together such a thoughtful panel. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.